The German Shepherd sold for $5. Not 500. Not 50. 5. He stood in the middle of the county auction yard with his head down and his ribs showing through matted fur, dried blood crusted along his left ear, 3 parallel scars carved across his muzzle like someone had dragged him through wire. The auctioneer didn't even bother describing him, just held up the leash and said, "Retired K9, temperament unknown, no medical records, no handler transfer papers. Who'll start at 5? Nobody moved. Megan Whitmore stood at the back of the crowd with her coffee going cold in her hand, watching the dog and feeling something shift in her chest that she couldn't name yet. She raised her hand. The moment the leash touched her palm, the shepherd lifted his head and looked at her with amber eyes that weren't broken at all. They were waiting. If this story finds you tonight, stay with me until the end. Like this video, leave a comment with the city and country where you're watching. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You won't want to miss what happens next. The auction was held on a Tuesday in late October, out behind the Garner County Fairgrounds, where the gravel lot smelled like diesel and old hay. Megan had come for a different reason entirely. A coworker had mentioned a livestock sale, and she'd driven 40 minutes on her day off because she needed something to do that wasn't sitting in her apartment staring at the walls. She hadn't planned on bidding on anything. She definitely hadn't planned on a dog. She was 29 years old and worked trauma at Redwood Valley Military Medical Center, 3 12-hour shifts a week minimum, more when they were short-staffed, which was almost always. She lived alone in a second-floor unit on Callahan Street with a broken dishwasher she'd been meaning to call about for 6 weeks, and a houseplant that had somehow survived 2 years of her mostly ignoring it. A dog made no practical sense. She bought him anyway. The handler who handed over the leash was a heavy-set man with a county badge clipped to his belt and the expression of someone who'd already moved on to the next item. He passed her a thin manila folder, photocopied vaccination records from 3 years ago, a single-page intake form with half the fields left blank, and a laminated card identifying the animal as K9 Unit, Rook, German Shepherd, male, extintor 7 years, status, retired. No unit designation, no handler name, no agency seal. "Where'd he come from?" Megan asked. The man shrugged. "Transfer from Federal Holding. That's all I got." "Federal Holding isn't a kennel." "No, it's not." He tipped his head toward the folder. "Everything we have is in there." She looked down at the dog. He was sitting very still beside her left leg, which was already unusual. Most dogs she'd known would have been pulling toward the exit or pressing against a stranger's knee for comfort. This one just sat, back straight, ears forward, watching the space in front of them with a kind of patient attention that felt professional, deliberate. She'd seen that posture before. Not in pets, in working animals. The drive back to Redwood Valley took 45 minutes on the interstate, and Rook spent the entire trip in the back seat with his head resting on the center console beside her arm, not pushing into her space, just present, aware. Every time a truck passed on the left, his gaze tracked it through the window and then returned forward, alert without being reactive, controlled. "You're not what they said you were," Megan told him. He didn't move, but his ear rotated toward her voice. She got him home, set up a secondhand crate she'd grabbed from a donation bin outside the auction grounds, and spent an hour just watching him move around her apartment. He investigated every corner methodically, not sniffing frantically like a nervous dog, but working in a grid pattern, clearing the space room by room. He paused at the window above the street for almost 3 minutes, tracking something she couldn't see. He avoided the houseplant. He found the one spot on the living room rug where the afternoon light came through the blinds at a low angle and lay down in it precisely, chin on his forepaws. Then he looked at her. "Okay," she said. "We'll figure it out." One. She went back to work Thursday morning, back to the familiar rhythm of Redwood Valley's trauma bays. The overhead pages, the rolling crash carts, the particular smell of antiseptic and burned coffee that she'd stopped noticing years ago. The hospital occupied a converted military installation on the north edge of town, a sprawling concrete complex that had been rebuilt and expanded 3 times since its original construction. It served active military personnel, veterans, and the surrounding civilian population, which made it busier and more complicated than most civilian trauma centers and significantly more political. Megan had been there 2 years. She was good at her job and mostly kept to herself, which suited her just fine. She knew her coworkers well enough to be efficient with them, but not well enough to have to explain herself. The nursing staff called her steady, the attendings called her reliable. Nobody called her anything more than that, and she preferred it. She didn't talk about her years before nursing school. Not because it was traumatic, or not only because of that, but because it changed the way people looked at her, and she'd grown tired of being looked at differently. What she'd been, before she was a nurse, was a soldier. Specifically, she'd been a 68 W combat medic, attached to a special operations support element that she was still technically not supposed to discuss in any detail. 4 years active, 2 deployments, 1 extended assignment that had taken her to places that didn't appear on the paperwork. She'd learned to treat penetrating trauma in conditions that made the hospital's worst nights look manageable. She'd learned to move tactically, think tactically, assess threat and terrain and personnel with the kind of automatic precision that didn't go away when you left the uniform behind. It just went quiet. Folded down under the surface of regular life like a tarp over equipment you weren't using. She'd left the Army at 24, gone to nursing school on the GI Bill, and built a version of herself that fit inside the walls of a hospital. It worked. Most days it worked fine. She thought about her discharge sometimes. Mostly at 3 a.m., mostly when a patient coded and she had to think through it differently than the protocols suggested, had to use instincts that came from somewhere the textbooks didn't cover. She never talked about it. What she did on Thursday morning was check on a post-op vet with a femoral graft, push meds for 2 patients in Bay 3 and 4, assist in a chest closure that ran long, eat half a granola bar standing at the nurse's station, and think intermittently about the dog she'd left at home with a bowl of water and the television on low. She thought about the folder, the blank fields, the agency seal that wasn't there. Friday night she spread what she had across the kitchen table, the intake form, the photocopied vaccination records, the laminated ID card, and looked at it more carefully. Rook sat beside her chair watching her the way he'd watched everything else, with complete attention, no urgency. "Rook," she said, "what kind of name is that for a police dog?" Most law enforcement K9s got operational names, short, hard consonants, easy to call in a field environment. Rook wasn't unusual, but it also wasn't random. Rook was a chess piece, specifically a piece that moved in straight lines and protected the king. She tried the name out of habit more than expectation. Rook, heel. He moved to her left side instantly and sat. The response was too precise, too automatic. That wasn't the response of a dog trained for patrol or basic detection work. That was tactical obedience, the kind trained into dogs attached to special operations units, where the handler might be moving under fire and needed the animal to respond to voice commands without a second's lag. "Fuss," she said, German command for heel, common in Malinois and Shepherd working lines. He didn't move. "Higher." German for come. He came. "Bleib." "Stay." He stayed. She stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen. He remained exactly where she'd left him until she came back, at which point he tracked her with his eyes but held the position. "Okay," she said. She sat back down. Her coffee was getting cold again. "You're not a county K9. She thought for a moment, then said one more thing. Not a command, just a word. "Sentinel." Rook stood up. Every muscle in his body went to attention. He stared at her with an expression that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite recognition, but was something between the two that made the hair on her arms stand up. She sat very still. "Where did you hear that word?" she asked, which was stupid because he was a dog and he couldn't answer. But she already knew she'd heard it before. Somewhere she wasn't supposed to have been, doing something she wasn't supposed to talk about. A unit designation. A name that had been redacted out of after-action reports she'd glimpsed at the edge of her clearance. Task Force Sentinel. Check. She called her friend Petra Novak on Saturday morning. Petra was a veterinary technician at the animal hospital 2 miles from Megan's apartment, and she owed Megan a favor going back to a dislocated shoulder that Petra had very much preferred not to explain to an ER doctor. Megan brought Rook in through the back entrance at 7:30 before the clinic opened. Petra took one look at him and said, "He's not a stray." "I know." "Where'd you get him?" "County auction." "A dog like this doesn't end up at a county auction." "No," Megan agreed. "He doesn't." Petra did a full physical while Megan held the leash and Rook tolerated the examination with the resigned patience of an animal that had been through far worse. His weight was low, 15, maybe 20 pounds under where he should be. The scars on his muzzle were old, healed clean, consistent with wire or shrapnel. There was newer bruising along his left flank, and when Petra palpated his ribs, something in Rook's breathing changed slightly. A controlled suppression of pain that was itself a sign of advanced training. "These aren't patrol injuries," Petra said, moving her hands carefully along his spine. "This dog has worked in the field. Serious field." "I know." "Megan, what's going on?" "I'm not sure yet." Petra found the chip under standard protocol. Scanner along the neck and shoulders. And then she found the second one, lower, between the shoulder blades at an angle that wasn't standard insertion placement. She looked at Megan. Megan looked at the chip. "That's not a vet chip," Megan said. "No, it's the wrong form factor. I've never seen an implant placed there." Megan pulled out her phone and thought about it for a moment. She took a photo of the scanner reading, a string of digits that didn't follow standard ISO chip format, 12 characters, where there should have been 15. Then she put her phone away. "Can you keep him here for a few hours?" she asked. "What are you going to do?" "Something probably inadvisable." Petra gave her a look. "Same as always, then." The Redwood Valley Public Library had a Veterans Resource Terminal that gave access to a handful of declassified military databases. Nothing sensitive, mostly unit histories, deployment records, official press releases. It wasn't what Megan needed, but it was a starting point, and starting points were what she had. She searched Task Force Sentinel first. Got 3 results. A brief 2019 press release announcing the unit's deactivation following an operation in Central America, a congressional mention in an unrelated budget hearing, and a single paragraph in a Veterans Affairs newsletter describing the unit as lost with all hands during a cartel interdiction mission, the details of which remain classified. Lost with all hands. She sat with that for a moment. Special operations units weren't often reported as entirely lost. It happened, but it was rare, and when it did, there was usually a formal process. Memorial services, posthumous decorations, next of kin notification. She typed in a few variations, searched the names of units that had operated in the same region during the same period, found nothing that gave her more than she already had. What she couldn't find was a K9 attached to Sentinel. No designation, no handler name, no record of a working dog deployed with the unit at all, which meant either Rook wasn't officially part of the mission or someone had removed that record. She was leaning toward the second option. On her way back to the clinic, she stopped at a hardware store and bought a small signal frequency scanner, the kind used to check for electronic interference in equipment, sold legally for industrial diagnostic purposes. It wasn't designed for military-grade chip readers, but it would tell her something about the second implant's broadcast frequency. Back at the clinic, with Rook lying calm on the exam table and Petra watching from the doorway with her arms crossed, Megan ran the scanner over the secondary chip. It pinged at a frequency range that sat outside standard veterinary implant parameters and inside military asset tracking parameters, the range used by the Department of Defense for equipment and personnel in classified operational environments. Not personnel. Assets. Rook had been tagged as a military asset, not a retired service animal handed over through proper channels. An asset that had been logged somewhere, tracked somewhere, and at some point officially ceased to exist. "Someone didn't retire this dog," Megan said, mostly to herself. "Someone tried to erase him," Petra said quietly. "Megan, you should be careful." "I'm always careful." "No, you're always competent. That's different from careful." Megan looked at Rook. He was watching her with those amber eyes that had caught her attention across a gravel auction yard and hadn't let go since. She thought about the way he'd reacted to the word Sentinel. Thought about the intake form with the blank fields. Thought about the fact that a military working dog with a classified asset chip had been sold at a county auction for $5, like he was a piece of broken furniture. You didn't lose track of a classified asset accidentally. That wasn't how it worked. The paperwork alone would have flagged it. You lost track of something like that deliberately, and you needed a chain of human decisions to make it happen. Multiple points of failure that were actually points of choice. "He's not broken," she said. "That's why they dumped him. If he'd been broken, they wouldn't have needed to." She folded up the scanner and put it in her bag. "I need to find out who logged this chip," she said. and I need to do it without triggering whatever flag might be attached to that chip ID. How are you going to do that? Megan thought for a moment. Carefully. She had a name from her own service, a woman she'd overlapped with briefly during her second deployment, a former NCIS investigator who'd been embedded with the support element for a 3-month stretch doing liaison work that Megan had never fully understood. The woman's name was Olivia Hartwell, and the last Megan had heard, she was somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. That had been 4 years ago. People moved. She spent Saturday evening tracking down a current contact, which took longer than she would have liked, and required calling 2 people she hadn't spoken to in years, and having a conversation with a retired warrant officer in Spokane who gave her a phone number with a Tacoma area code. She left a message. "This is Megan Whitmore. You won't remember me, but we worked together in—" She paused, choosing her words. "A shared environment, 2018. I have something that might be relevant to a unit we both knew of. Not on the phone. If you're still in the business of asking questions, I'd like to talk." She hung up and sat in the quiet of her apartment. Rook was asleep in the stripe of light from the hallway, nose tucked under his tail, breathing steadily. She looked at the laminated ID card on her kitchen table. Rook. K9. Status? Retired. Not retired. Erased. She thought about Task Force Sentinel. Lost with all hands. Details classified. She thought about the men and women that phrase covered, what it meant to their families, what it meant that a dog who had apparently survived whatever the unit hadn't was sitting in her apartment with a government tracking chip and no official existence. Her phone buzzed at 11:47. Text from an unknown number. 4 words. "I remember you. Tomorrow." The coffee shop. Olivia Hartwell chose was a narrow place on the corner of Vance and 9th, with exposed brick and bad lighting and enough ambient noise to make it difficult to be overheard. She was already there when Megan arrived, a compact woman in her early 40s with close-cut dark hair and the particular stillness of someone who had spent years watching rooms for threats and couldn't entirely stop. She looked at Megan across the table and said, "You look exactly the same." "You look tired," Megan said. Olivia almost smiled. "That's accurate." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Tell me about the dog." Megan told her. All of it. The auction, the intake form, the chip placement, the frequency range, the reaction to the word Sentinel. Olivia listened without interrupting, her expression neutral and controlled, though twice she went very still in a way that meant she wasn't neutral at all. When Megan finished, Olivia was quiet for a long moment. "How did he end up at a county auction?" she said finally. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. Who held him before that?" "Federal holding, according to the intake form, no agency specified." Federal holding doesn't transfer assets without agency authorization. Someone signed off on that transfer, someone who had the clearance to access the asset record and the authority to modify it. So it goes up the chain. Everything goes up the chain. Olivia looked at her hands. "I left NCIS 14 months ago. I didn't leave cleanly. There were questions I was asking that certain people wanted me to stop asking." "About Sentinel?" Olivia looked up. "About what happened to Sentinel. Officially, the unit was lost in an ambush. Cartel operation, wrong intelligence, wrong place. Happens. Tragic. Classified. End of story." She paused. "Except 2 weeks before the mission, I flagged anomalies in the financial records attached to the operational budget. Equipment acquisitions that didn't match deployment manifests. Money going somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. And I was told to close the file. And then I was told I was being reassigned. And then I was told, very quietly, that I was being given the opportunity to retire with full benefits if I chose not to pursue certain lines of inquiry." "So you left?" "I left," Olivia said flatly. "I had a kid at home and a mortgage, and not enough evidence to take to anyone who would have acted on it." She looked directly at Megan. "What you found on that dog, that secondary chip. If it's what you're describing, it might be exactly the kind of evidence I didn't have." "What kind of data could a chip like that carry?" "Depends on the application. Location logs, minimally, possibly more. Operational data synced during field deployment. If Rook was in the field when things went wrong, his chip might have recorded communications, positioning, proximity data, a timestamp record of where he was and when." Megan thought about that. A record of where the unit was when they were there and what happened to them. A record that existed in a small chip between a dog's shoulder blades, riding around in the back seat of her car, because whoever had decided to erase Sentinel had overlooked one detail, or hadn't been able to eliminate him in time, or had tried and failed and settled for dumping him through channels where he'd disappear quietly. $5. No medical records. No handler transfer papers. A dog nobody was supposed to look at twice. Who ran Sentinel? Megan asked. Olivia set her cup down carefully. Operationally, the unit reported to Commander Victor Hale. Joint Special Operations. Worked both DoD and federal assignments. Very decorated, very connected. She paused. Still active. Still connected. The name settled into the room between them with the kind of weight that meant something. Megan thought about the way Rook had stood at her window at 3 a.m, tracking something in the street below with absolute motionless attention. She thought about how he'd reacted when she said the word sentinel. Not fear, not aggression, recognition, the way a soldier reacted to the name of their unit. He's not safe, Olivia said quietly. If someone is looking for that chip... He's been with me 6 days, Megan said. If they knew where he was, they would have already moved. Unless they're watching to see what you do with him. Megan looked at the table. Her coffee was untouched and cold. Outside, a delivery truck blocked the intersection for a moment, and she watched it without watching it, cataloging position, exit points, the man at the counter who'd been on his phone since she walked in without ordering anything. Old habits, quiet and automatic and never fully dormant. Then we need to move faster than they expect, she said. Megan. Olivia's voice was careful. You understand what you're walking into. I have a general sense of it. Hale has assets. He has people who are very good at making problems go away quietly. If he decides you're a problem, he already knows I bought the dog, Megan said. If he's watching, he knew the moment I raised my hand at that auction. She finally picked up her coffee, found it cold, set it back down. So the question isn't whether I'm already in this. It's whether I'm going to sit here and wait for something to happen or get ahead of it. Olivia looked at her for a long moment. You said you were a 68W, she said. That's correct? Special Operations Support. That's correct. What else? Megan met her eyes evenly. What else do you need? Olivia sat back in her chair. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite relief, but something adjacent to it. The look of someone who had been carrying something heavy alone for a long time and had just found someone else willing to take a grip on the other end. Okay, she said, then here's what I still have. She reached into her jacket and put a thumb drive on the table between them. Old, scratched, a piece of tape on the side with a date written in pen. 10 months ago. Copies of the financial records I flagged before they closed my access. Not everything, but enough to show the pattern. She didn't move her hand from the drive yet. If what's on that chip corroborates what's on here, we have something real. Megan looked at the drive. She thought about Rook at home in her apartment, sleeping in the stripe of hall light, carrying information in his body that people had tried to bury under 100 layers of redaction and institutional silence. Carrying it faithfully, the way working dogs carried everything, without knowing exactly what it meant, without knowing they were doing it, just doing their job, just holding on. Then let's find out what's on the chip, she said. She picked up the drive. And 2 tables behind her, the man who hadn't ordered anything finally put away his phone, stood up, and walked out into the street. Megan was already moving before she consciously decided to. Not fast. That would have been obvious. She stood, pulled on her jacket with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had somewhere else to be, tucked Olivia's thumb drive into the inner pocket, and said quietly, Don't look at the door. Man in a gray jacket just left. He's been here since before I arrived. Olivia didn't look. She picked up her cup and took a sip of coffee she'd already finished, like she was deciding whether to order another. You get a read on him? Phone out the whole time, never ordered, left within 30 seconds of me picking up the drive. Megan pushed in her chair. Could be nothing. Could be. Neither of them thought it was nothing. They left separately, 2 minutes apart, and Megan took the long way back to her car. Around the block, through the alley behind the dry cleaner on Vance, doubling back once to confirm she wasn't being followed on foot. She didn't see the gray jacket again. That didn't make her feel better. People who were good at this didn't let you see them twice. She drove home with both hands on the wheel and her eyes moving between the road and the mirrors in a pattern she hadn't consciously used in years, but hadn't forgotten either. Rook was sitting at the apartment door when she came in, which he did every time. But this evening there was something different in his posture. A subtle elevation of tension across his shoulders, ears angled toward the window that faced the street. She went to the window and looked out without turning on the light. A black SUV was parked at the curb across from her building. It had been there when she left that morning. She hadn't registered it then. Now she did. She stood back from the glass and thought for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and texted Olivia a single number, 2. 2 minutes later, Olivia texted back. Confirmed. Same plate from the coffee shop lot. They have 2 vehicles. Megan set her phone face down on the counter and looked at Rook. Okay, she said. We're not going to panic about this. He looked at her steadily. That wasn't for you, she said. That was for me. She didn't sleep much. She spent the hours between midnight and 4 at her kitchen table with Olivia's thumb drive plugged into her personal laptop, the old one she used for nothing work-related, never connected to the hospital network, bought secondhand 2 years ago for exactly the kind of privacy that she hadn't known at the time she was going to need. The financial records were dense and deliberately obscured, the kind of obfuscation that looked like bureaucratic noise until you understood what you were looking for. Equipment acquisition orders cross-referenced against deployment manifests that didn't align. Procurement records for hardware that had no corresponding field deployment authorization. A pattern of transfers between 3 holding accounts, all flagged as operational expenses for Task Force Sentinel, all dated in the 6 weeks before the unit was officially lost. The money hadn't paid for equipment. It had moved. Specifically, it had moved out of DoD operational accounts and into a holding structure that Megan couldn't fully trace from what Olivia had, but the shape of it was clear enough. Someone had been routing funds through the unit's operational budget in the weeks leading up to the mission. Someone with access to both the financial architecture and the operational planning. Someone like a commanding officer. She copied the relevant files to her own drive, added notes in a separate document, and sat back in her chair with her eyes tired and her thoughts running fast and clean in the way they did when she was past tired and into that second wind state that combat medicine had trained into her. The state where everything got quiet and simple, where the noise dropped away and what was left was just the problem and the variables and what needed to happen next. What needed to happen next was reading the chip. Not scanning it, reading it, actually extracting whatever data it held. That required equipment she didn't have, an expertise she only partially possessed, and the person she knew who had both was a man she hadn't spoken to in 3 years for reasons that were complicated and personal and not entirely resolved. She sent the text at 4:17 in the morning because waiting until a reasonable hour felt like a luxury she wasn't sure she had. This is Megan Whitmore. I need a technical favor. It's time-sensitive and it involves classified military hardware. I understand if you can't, but I needed to ask you first. She plugged in her phone to charge, let Rook out the back of the building to the small fenced yard, stood in the cold October dark while he worked the perimeter with his nose, and thought about Victor Hale. She didn't know Hale personally. His name had come up during her service in the way that senior officers' names came up, peripheral, contextual, attached to operations that touched the edges of her assignment without being central to it. What she did know, from Olivia's records and her own fragmentary memory, was that Hale was effective, politically connected, and very good at operating in the space between official procedure and the thing that actually happened. That combination of qualities was valuable in certain environments. It was also dangerous when it went wrong, because the same skills that made someone good at classified operations made them very good at protecting themselves when those operations became inconvenient. She thought about the words, "lost with all hands." Thought about what it would require to make an entire special operations unit disappear under the cover of a cartel ambush. Not just the tactical execution of it, though that alone was a significant thing, but the administrative cover, the paperwork, the chain of authorization that would have to be manipulated, the people who would have had to look the other way or be managed into silence. You didn't do that alone, but you could do it with the right combination of authority, leverage, and access. With enough of those things, a man in the right position could make almost anything disappear. Almost. He'd missed the dog. Her phone buzzed. Text from the number she'd written to, "Call me." His name was Derek Farwell. He'd been an Army Signal Corps warrant officer, then a civilian contractor for a defense technology firm. Then, when she'd known him briefly, something that occupied an ambiguous space between those two things. He was good with embedded systems in the way that certain people were good with languages, not just trained in them, but intuitive about them, able to read the logic of hardware the way other people read faces. They'd met during her second deployment. What had developed between them was something she didn't have a clean name for and hadn't tried very hard to name. What ended it was the nature of what they both did and the fact that neither of them was built for the kind of emotional availability that a real relationship required. They'd parted without acrimony and without closure, which was its own kind of complicated. She called him from the backyard while Rook sat beside her knee in the dark. "Megan," he said. No surprise in his voice. He'd always been hard to surprise. "Derek, you said classified military hardware. Secondary implant, non-standard placement, military asset tracking frequency. I need to know what's on it without triggering whatever flag might be attached to the ID." A pause. "What animal?" "German Shepherd." Another pause, longer. "How did you come across a dog with that kind of implant?" "County auction." That's not an answer. It's the whole answer. Someone ran a chain of administrative decisions that ended with a classified asset in a county auction lot, and I need to know what he recorded before they figure out I'm looking. Silence on the line. She could hear him breathing, which meant he was thinking. When Derek went quiet, and you couldn't hear him at all, that meant he'd already decided and was just letting you think he was still considering it. "I can't do it remotely," he said finally. "I'd need the animal present, and I'd need a specific reader. I have one, but it's at my shop." "Where are you?" "Ridgeline, about 90 miles north." "I can be there by 7. That's 5 in the morning, Megan." "I know what time it is." He exhaled slowly. "Okay, come to the shop, not the house." A pause. "Bring coffee, not gas station coffee." She almost said something, didn't. "See you at 7. She took Rook and left before 5, going out the back of the building rather than the front. The black SUV was still on the street when she checked from an upstairs window, and there was a second vehicle, sedan, dark blue, parked at the far end of the block. She went through the building's utility exit, through the yard and out the alley that ran behind the row of buildings on Callahan, and brought her car around from the side street where she'd parked it the previous evening out of a habit she was now grateful for. The drive north was mostly empty interstate and dark sky, and Rook's steady breathing from the back seat. She stopped once for coffee, not gas station coffee, and made it to Ridgeline at 6:58. Derek's shop was a converted garage at the edge of a commercial block, unmarked except for a small panel next to the door that had once held a business name and now held nothing. He buzzed her in without speaking through the intercom. He looked older than she remembered, which was obvious and irrelevant, and she noted it anyway. 41 now, maybe 42. The same angular face and the same careful economy of movement, like every gesture was considered before it was made. He looked at Rook with something between professional interest and surprise. "He's in better shape than I expected from a county auction." "He was in worse shape 3 days ago." Megan handed him one of the coffees. "He eats. He's resilient. Like his owner." She didn't respond to that. He didn't expect her to. He worked on Rook for 40 minutes with equipment she'd never seen before and wouldn't have been able to fully describe. A reader that connected wirelessly to a hardened laptop, a second device that he explained was a frequency isolator, designed to query and implant secondary memory without transmitting the chip's ID to any external network. Rook lay on a padded mat and allowed the process with the calm cooperation of an animal that had been handled by professionals his entire life. Derek sat back eventually and looked at the screen. "How long do you have?" he asked. "However long it takes." "Then sit down." She sat. What the chip contained was a location and timestamp log going back 14 months, recorded at irregular intervals. The intervals corresponding, she realized as she looked at the data, to proximity to active field communications equipment. Every time Rook had been within range of certain hardware, the chip had recorded position, time, and a hash of the nearby signal environment. Most of the log was operational noise, training locations, base facility coordinates, a series of positions in the southwestern United States that traced a route consistent with pre-deployment staging. And then, approximately 11 months ago, a cluster of entries from a location that wasn't on any base. "Where's that?" she asked, pointing at the coordinates. Derek ran them against a mapping application. A topographic overlay came up. Remote terrain, heavy tree cover, no labeled infrastructure. Then he overlaid road data, and a single access road appeared, connecting the coordinates to a county highway 40 miles south of the Redwood Valley city limits. Private land, he said, or federal land with private use authorization. Pull the parcel data. He navigated through county land records and came up with a holding company. 2 layers of corporate ownership later, he hit a name she didn't recognize, but Olivia would. She photographed the screen. Then Derek pointed to the last entry in the log. This is the most recent position record. He cross-referenced it. That's Garner County. That's approximately the fairgrounds, Megan said, the auction site. He looked at her. Megan, if the people who placed this chip were watching for an activation, they know exactly where this dog has been. I know. They know he's here. They might know he's here right now. I know that too. Derek leaned back in his chair and looked at her the way he used to look at her when she'd just told him she was going to do something he thought was going to get her killed. Not alarmed. He didn't alarm easily, just very direct. What are you going to do with this? Before she could answer, her phone buzzed. Olivia, she answered immediately. We have a problem, Olivia said. Her voice was controlled but clipped, which in Olivia's register meant something serious. I got a call 20 minutes ago from a contact inside JAG. Someone ran Rook's chip ID last night. Not a query, a trace request. Active, not historical. Meaning? Meaning someone who knew the chip existed and knew the ID number tried to locate the chip at a beat. 11:47 last night, about 4 hours after we met. Megan did the math. The man in the gray jacket. 30 seconds after she'd picked up the drive. They didn't get a location? The trace came back no response because Derek's isolator was active, Olivia said, and then paused. Wait, how do I know Derek was running an isolator? Because I'm at his shop, Megan said. And we just read the chip. A silence. Then, okay, what did you find? Enough. The location data puts Rook at a site south of Redwood Valley approximately 11 months ago, right before the unit went dark. I have coordinates and a property ownership trail I need you to run. She read out the holding company name. And there's one more thing. What? The last entry in the location log before the fairgrounds. It's from 6 weeks ago, not 11 months, 6 weeks. A long silence. He was somewhere 6 weeks ago, Olivia said slowly, after Sentinel was officially declared lost. After 11 months of no signal entries, which means either the chip malfunctioned for 11 months and suddenly started working again, or someone was holding him somewhere, Olivia finished, somewhere without active field communications equipment, somewhere isolated enough that the chip never had anything to ping off of. And 6 weeks ago, something changed. He got moved, or the location changed, or they decided to get rid of him and moved him through a facility where the chip caught a signal before they passed him to county, Olivia said. Megan, this is bigger than I thought. I know. If Hale held him for 11 months after the mission, if he's been actively maintaining custody of a classified asset off book all this time, that's not just corruption. That's ongoing criminal conspiracy. That's evidence suppression. That's enough to bury someone, Megan said, or enough reason for someone to want to bury us first. Derek was watching her from across the room. His expression hadn't changed, but his posture had. That subtle shift from passive to ready, the kind you only saw in people who knew what it looked like when a situation crossed a threshold. Rook had stood up from the mat. He was facing the door. Megan registered that at the same time she registered the sound. Not loud, not alarming, just the soft crunch of tires on gravel outside, moving slowly, not pulling into the lot. Olivia, she said quietly, I have to go. Where? She looked at Derek. He was already crossing to the window at the side of the room, moving along the wall, staying out of the sight line from outside. Not sure yet, she said. Stay off your primary phone. Use the number I gave you in 2019. Megan. She hung up. Derek held up one finger without looking away from the window. One vehicle. He held up 2 fingers, 2 occupants. Then he made a small flat gesture with his hand that she read immediately. They stopped. Rook was absolutely motionless beside her, every muscle primed, his attention locked on the door with the focused readiness of a dog who understood exactly what that kind of stillness meant and was waiting for her signal. She didn't give one yet. She moved to the far side of the room, behind the workbench, where she could see both the door and the side window, and neither angle could see her without moving. She thought through the space: one entrance, the door they'd come in, and a fire exit at the back of the shop she'd clocked automatically when she walked in. Derek came away from the window. He didn't speak. He held up his phone so she could see the screen, a still image from a security camera mounted above the exterior door. Two men in dark civilian clothes stood beside a black SUV parked across the narrow lot. One of them was looking at the building, the other was on a phone. She recognized the SUV, same plate, the same vehicle that had been parked outside her apartment on Callahan Street. They hadn't come here by coincidence, and they hadn't followed her. She was certain she hadn't been followed, which meant they'd tracked the chip. The isolator had blocked the trace request, but at some point in the night, before Derek had started the isolation protocol, there must have been a window, a brief contact. Enough for a directional signal, not a precise location, but enough to narrow it down, enough to know roughly where to look. She glanced at the back exit, then back at the camera feed. The two men hadn't moved, not coming in, not leaving, just watching. "They're waiting," she said quietly, thinking it through. Waiting for instruction or waiting for backup. "Either option has a clock on it," Derek said. "I know." She looked at Rook. He was still locked on the door, still waiting. She put her hand lightly on the back of his neck. Not a command, just contact, and felt the controlled tension in him like a current. "We need to get the data out before they come in, or before whatever they're waiting for arrives. I can compress it to the drive in 4 minutes. Do it." He was already moving to the laptop. She kept her eyes on the camera feed on her phone, watching the two men, reading their body language, the way they held themselves, the slight angle of the one still on the phone, listening more than speaking now, nodding, receiving new instructions. The one who'd been watching the building reached back into the SUV. When his hand came back out, Megan had already crossed the room to stand beside the fire exit. "Derek," she said. "How long?" 90 seconds. The man outside was holding a radio, not a phone. And behind the SUV, at the far edge of the camera's field of view, a second vehicle was pulling slowly into the lot. "They're not waiting for backup," she said. "It just arrived." Derek copied the last file at the same moment Megan pushed the fire exit bar. The door swung out into a narrow service lane behind the building. Gravel, a dumpster, a wooden fence running the length of the block. Cold morning air hit her face. She looked both ways without breaking stride. Nothing moving yet, but the second vehicle in the front lot would have a driver, and a driver watching the perimeter would have this lane covered within 30 seconds of the others going to the front door. "Left," Derek said behind her, already moving, laptop bag over one shoulder and the drive in his jacket pocket. She had the leash in her hand, but Rook wasn't pulling. He was matching her pace exactly, slightly behind her left knee, the way a working dog moved with a handler in a confined environment. Not panicked, operational. They went left, along the fence line, through a gap where two fence sections didn't quite meet, into the back lot of an auto parts warehouse that hadn't opened yet. Megan moved through it without running. Running attracted attention and burned energy she might need later, and came out on the cross street 2 blocks east of Derek's shop. She didn't hear anyone behind them. That didn't mean no one was there. "My car's north lot, half a block up," Derek said. "They'll have the plates by now." "Probably." He didn't slow down. "I have another vehicle in the warehouse bay. Keys are inside. It's not registered to me." She looked at him sideways. "Why do you have an unregistered vehicle in your warehouse bay?" "Same reason you keep a go bag under your bed," he said. "Because at some point you worked in a world where needing one and not having one was the last mistake you made." She couldn't argue with that. The warehouse bay was accessed through a side door with a keypad. Derek punched the code without hesitation. And inside, between 2 rows of shelving stacked with equipment cases, sat a 5-year-old gray pickup truck with a working camper shell. Plain, forgettable, the kind of vehicle that disappeared into highway traffic instantly. He grabbed a key fob from a hook inside the door and tossed it to her. "Take the 9 north, get off at the Harwick exit, and stay off toll roads," he said. He was pulling a hard case from the bottom shelf. Compact, latched, heavy in a way that was specific. "What's in that?" she asked. "Things that might be useful and that I'd rather not explain to you right now." He put the case in the truck bed. "The drive is in your jacket. What do you need from me from here?" Nothing that puts you further in this. Megan, Derek. She met his eyes. You've done enough. More than I had a right to ask. If they made you in that shop, you need to put distance between yourself and this. You know how this works. He was quiet for a moment. The look on his face was the same one she'd seen 4 years ago. The one that said he understood the logic and resented it simultaneously. If you need the technical support going forward, I'll call. You won't. You'll decide you're protecting me. I'll call, she said again, more firmly. I promise. He held her gaze for another second, then nodded once. Go. She loaded Rook into the truck cab, pulled out of the warehouse onto the service alley, and was on the 9 North in under 4 minutes. She drove for 40 minutes before she felt settled enough to think clearly, which told her that she'd been more rattled than she'd let herself register. The training didn't eliminate the adrenaline. It just held it at a manageable distance until your hands stopped shaking and your prefrontal cortex came back online. She was aware of the shaking only after it stopped. Rook sat in the passenger seat. He'd claimed it by resting his chin on the center console and looking at her with an expression so steady that it was almost funny. A dog who had outrun a tactical surveillance team before breakfast and was now entirely at ease because the person beside him knew what she was doing. She hoped he was right about that. She called Olivia from the truck's hands-free, using the number from 2019 on a prepaid phone she'd bought at a convenience store off the Harwick exit. 3 rings. Tell me you're clear, Olivia said. Clear. 2 vehicles, 4 men minimum. They had the chip ID and narrowed the location from a partial signal window. She merged onto the highway. We're burned on the shop, and they know what I'm driving. Where are you going? I need somewhere to work that isn't connected to either of us. And I need you to run the holding company name I gave you, the property trail from the chip data. I'm already on it. The sound of typing. The holding company has 3 layers of shell ownership, but the bottom layer traces to a private land management LLC that filed a federal use agreement with DoD 6 years ago. The authorized contact on the agreement, a pause, the kind that meant something significant, is listed as V. Hale, Commander, Joint Special Operations. Megan's grip tightened on the wheel. He owns the property. His LLC does. Which is not the same thing legally, but operationally, yes. And the location from the chip data, the cluster of entries 11 months ago, that property is 63 acres of private timberland on a federal adjacent parcel. There's a structure on it, 1 building accessed by a single road. No utilities listed, but there's a DoD equipment authorization from 4 years ago for mobile power generation. Off-grid facility, Megan said. He was running something out there. Or storing something. Olivia's voice dropped slightly. Megan, if he held Rook at that location for 11 months after the mission, if that's where the dog was kept, then either Hale was using the facility post-mission for something he needed the dog to guard, or he needed the dog alive because Rook is the only witness he couldn't make disappear. That landed somewhere uncomfortable. A working dog trained for special operations wasn't just a weapon. It was a partner and a tool with specific operational knowledge. Rook would know locations by scent. He would know the body language of the men he'd worked with. He would alert on specific target profiles that had been trained into him. In the right context, with the right handler, that was operational intelligence. But there was another possibility, and it was the one sitting heavier in the back of Megan's thinking. What if Hale couldn't get rid of him because of the chip, she said. A silence. Explain. The chip is DoD issued on a classified asset. If Rook died, officially, verifiably died, there would have to be an asset termination record. Someone in the system would have to process the closure. That creates a record trail. Someone asking questions about why a classified K9 attached to a unit that was officially lost in the field was processed for termination 11 months after the fact. That's the kind of anomaly that flags. So Hale kept him alive to avoid generating a termination record, Olivia said slowly. Kept him alive, kept him isolated at a facility without enough signal to ping the chip. And when he finally needed to get rid of him, he ran him through county channels. Stripped the handler paperwork, buried the agency trail, listed him as a retired patrol dog. Sold him for $5 at an auction where nobody was supposed to look twice. He just needed Rook to disappear quietly. Instead, I raised my hand. Olivia exhaled. How much of this can we put in front of someone credible? Because right now what we have is financial records that got me pushed out of NCIS, chip data from a non-standard read that would be challenged in any formal proceeding, and a land ownership trail that connects Hale to a location but doesn't tell us what was there. We need what was at that facility, Megan said. Not just that Hale owned it. Then we need to go there. I know. She had already been thinking about that. Already been mapping the practical problem of approaching a remote 63-acre property that Hale might be actively monitoring, with no backup, no official standing, and a dog with a chip that might broadcast their position if Derek's isolation protocol had a coverage limit. Not alone, Olivia said. You can't go alone. I know that too. Megan changed lanes and thought. There's a man at my hospital, Colonel Everett Krause. He's the chief of military medicine, ex-Army SF. He's been quiet about certain things for years in a way that always read to me like someone sitting on something difficult. He was at Redwood Valley before I was. He might know Sentinel, or he might know enough to point us towards someone who does. You trust him? I trust that he's spent 30 years being more careful than the people around him. That's not the same as trust, but it's a start. Can you get to him without going back to the hospital? She thought about the two vehicles at Derek's shop, about the black SUV outside her apartment, about the fact that Hale had people watching her within 24 hours of her sitting down with Olivia in a coffee shop that neither of them had used before. Carefully, she said. Same way I do everything. She didn't go to the hospital. She called the main desk from the prepaid phone, asked for Colonel Krause's external paging extension, which she knew from 2 years of working the same building, and left a message that was framed as a medication consult question with a callback number. Specific phrasing, follow up on the K9 behavioral protocol from the support element review. Language meaningless to anyone who didn't know what it referenced, possibly meaningful to someone who did. He called back in 18 minutes. Dr. Krause, she said. Whitmore. His voice was careful from the first syllable. He'd heard the language. Where are you calling from? Not my usual number. I need to talk to you about something that's come up, not over the phone. A long pause. How urgent? I'd say somewhere between very and extremely. Another pause. Longer. I know a diner off Route 7, about 12 miles east of the county line. It's called Baxter's. Booth's in the back. I can be there at noon. I'll be there. She arrived 20 minutes early and took the back booth with Rook on a downstay under the table, ordered coffee and eggs she didn't particularly want, and watched the door. Krause came in at noon exactly. A big, broad man in his early 60s with close-cropped silver hair and the economical posture of someone who had spent decades being in charge of rooms without needing to announce it. He spotted her immediately, came to the booth, and sat without preamble. He looked at Rook. Rook looked at him. Something shifted in Krause's face that he controlled almost instantly, but not quite in time. You recognize him, Megan said. Krause folded his hands on the table. He had a way of gathering himself before he spoke that she'd always noticed, like he was counting the cost of each sentence before he spent it. Where did you get that dog? County auction, $5. No records, wrong chip placement, military asset frequency. She watched him. His chip has location data from a remote facility south of the city 11 months ago. The facility connects through 3 layers of shell ownership to Commander Victor Hale. Nothing moved in Krause's face. That was itself an answer. You knew Sentinel, she said. He picked up the coffee cup the waitress had set in front of him without her noticing and drank from it slowly. Set it down. That's not a conversation I can have here. Then tell me where. I can't tell you where because I don't know what the situation is yet. He looked at her directly. I know what it looks like. I've known what it looked like for 11 months, and I've been waiting for something I could move on rather than something I could only suspect. He glanced at Rook again. That dog being alive, that changes the calculus. It changes it a lot, Megan agreed, but we need more than the chip data and the financial records. We need what's at that facility. Krause went very still. You're not thinking about going out there. I'm thinking it's the only evidence that puts Hale at the scene rather than just connected to the property. Megan, if Hale is monitoring that site, he may not be. If he'd planned to maintain it, he wouldn't have risked dumping the dog. He was closing things down. The question is whether he closed that facility down completely or whether there's still something there he couldn't move. She leaned forward slightly. You know his operational pattern. You know how he works. What's your read? Kraus was quiet for a moment. Outside, a truck rolled past on Route 7, and the diner windows shuddered faintly. He's methodical, Kraus said finally. He doesn't leave things undone, but he also doesn't destroy what he thinks he can control. He looked at her. If there was something at that facility he believed was secured and hidden, he might have left it rather than risk the movement of it. Movement creates exposure. Then there might be something there. There might. He pressed his fingers flat against the table. There's a former teammate of mine, retired CID, name is Ballard. He's been working a parallel thread on the Sentinel financials for 6 months through civilian channels. If I can reach him today and you can get me the property coordinates, we can put together a better picture of what we're walking into before anyone walks into it. How long does that take? 24 hours. Maybe less. She thought about the SUV on Callahan Street, the second vehicle at Derek's shop, the trace request on the chip at 11:47 last night. 24 hours felt like a long time to be moving and uncovered, but going to that property without any tactical picture was worse. Okay, she said, 24 hours. I'll send you the coordinates through Olivia Hartwell. Kraus's eyes sharpened. Hartwell is involved. She came to me. He absorbed that. Nodded once, slowly, the way someone nodded when a piece clicked into a larger picture they'd been assembling for a long time. She was right to. Megan spent the rest of the day moving. Not running, moving, which was different. She checked into a roadside motel off the highway under a name that matched the prepaid card she'd picked up with the phone, paid cash for one night, and spent 3 hours working through everything she had with Olivia via the secure channel Olivia had established after leaving NCIS. What they built together, across those 3 hours, was a picture that was ugly in its completeness. Task Force Sentinel had been deployed for a cartel interdiction operation 14 months ago, authorized under a joint DoD federal mandate with Commander Hale as the senior officer. The mission's stated objective was the seizure of a major narcotics shipment and the capture of a trafficking network's financial infrastructure. The mission's actual outcome, according to the official record, was the complete loss of the unit in an ambush, the destruction of the evidence, and a classified after-action report that had never been released. What the financial record suggested, what Olivia had flagged before being pushed out, was that the evidence hadn't been destroyed. It had been seized by Hale and redirected. Millions in cartel cash and financial records that should have been logged as interdicted evidence had instead passed through the same shell structure attached to his LLC. The unit itself hadn't been lost in an ambush. The unit had been eliminated because they were present when Hale made his move and couldn't be allowed to report what they'd seen. Rook had been there. Rook had seen it, not in any way that could be articulated or testified to. He was a dog, and dog testimony wasn't a legal concept. But his chip had recorded position and signal environment data from the exact location and time frame of the mission. Corroborated against the financial records and the property trail, it placed Hale at the scene during the window when the unit went dark, in a facility where money and operational equipment had been moved and stored. It wasn't a confession, but it was the spine of a case, and Megan could feel the shape of it hardening under her hands like a fracture being set. If Ballard's thread connects to this, Olivia said, we might have enough to take to JAG directly. Not NCIS, JAG. Military judicial, not investigative. Harder to bury. Hale has connections in JAG too. Everyone has connections everywhere. The question is whether the evidence is strong enough that the connections can't contain it. A pause. Megan, if we do this, we need to do it right. We need the facility evidence, we need everything packaged, and we need a recipient who can't be leaned on. I'm working on the recipient. Who? Someone Kraus trusts. He's making calls. Rook had been lying at the foot of the motel bed for 2 hours, and somewhere in the last 30 minutes he'd shifted, gradually, almost imperceptibly, from resting to alert. Megan had registered it without consciously noting it, the way you registered a change in ambient sound. She registered it now. She looked at him. He was facing the window, ears forward. She put the phone against her shoulder and moved to the side of the window, looking out through the gap in the curtain at the motel parking lot. The lot was mostly empty. Afternoon light was going gold and flat across the gravel. A minivan, Two pickup trucks, a sedan with a cracked taillight near the office entrance. She watched the sedan. "Olivia," she said quietly, "I need to call you back." She hung up before Olivia could respond and stood watching the sedan for 30 seconds. It hadn't moved. Nobody had gotten in or out. The cracked taillight was on the left side, distinctive, the kind of detail you'd remember if you'd seen it somewhere before. She hadn't seen it before. She was almost sure. Then the driver's window came down 2 inches, and a hand came out and adjusted the side mirror, angling it toward the row of rooms rather than the road. Not paranoia. Not almost sure. She moved away from the window, pulled on her jacket, clipped Rook's lead. She thought through the motel layout. The room was on the ground floor, second from the end, with a fire door at the corridor's far end that accessed the back lot. She'd clocked it when she checked in. She'd taken this room because it had 2 exits. She went out the back. The rear lot was a narrow strip of cracked asphalt between the building and a chain-link fence with a tree line behind it. Nobody visible. She moved left toward the end of the building, came around the corner far enough to see the front lot peripherally without being fully exposed. The sedan was still there. The mirror was still angled wrong. And a second car she hadn't seen when she'd checked in, dark, parked near the road entrance, engine idling, had its front wheels angled toward the exit, blocking the exit. They hadn't come to the door yet. Either they weren't certain which room she was in, or they were waiting for someone. Her phone buzzed in her jacket. Not Olivia's prepaid number, but her personal number, the one she hadn't used since leaving her apartment. She didn't recognize the incoming number. She answered anyway. The voice on the other end was male, calm, with the particular flatness of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. "Ms. Whitmore, I think we should talk before this gets any more complicated for everyone involved." Her pulse did not change. She'd been trained for this. The voice on the phone, the controlled tone, the implication that the person speaking had options and was generously offering you one of the easier ones. She'd been trained to recognize it as a tactic rather than an offer. "I don't know who this is," she said. "I think you do." She said nothing. "The dog has something that belongs to me," the voice said. "The data on his chip is classified property of the United States government, and you've been accessing it in ways that put you in significant legal jeopardy. Now, I'm not interested in making your life difficult, Ms. Whitmore. I'm interested in getting back what's mine and resolving this quietly. All you need to do is bring the dog to a location I'll specify, surrender the chip data and any copies, and walk away. No charges, no complications. You go back to your life." Megan looked at the dark car idling near the lot entrance. "You're just a nurse," the voice said, and she could hear the shape of the contempt in it. Not loud, not cruel, just present. The casual weight of someone who had decided what she was and what she was capable of before he'd ever encountered her. "You have no idea what you're fighting." She took a slow breath. "You forgot what kind of nurse I am." A pause. Brief, but there. "Excuse me?" She hung up. She looked at Rook. He was watching her face, reading it the way working dogs read handlers. Not the words, but the decision underneath the words. She'd made it. 24 hours was gone. Kraus or no Kraus, Ballard or no Ballard. She wasn't waiting in a shrinking perimeter while Hale tightened the circle around her. She needed to move toward the problem instead of waiting for it to arrive. She needed to go to the facility. Tonight. She pulled Rook close, turned away from the parking lot, and moved into the tree line behind the chain-link fence, already calculating the distance to the coordinates on the chip, the road access, the approach angle that a former combat medic with 4 years of special operations support and a K9 who knew exactly where they were going would choose if they were doing this without backup and without margin for error. Her personal phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. She powered it off, dropped it in her jacket pocket. 20 yards into the trees, she stopped. Rook had stopped first. He was pointing, his entire body aligned with the absolute precision of a trained detection dog on a confirmed scent, towards something in the dark ahead of them, something she couldn't see yet, something that was not a deer or a raccoon or any other thing that moved through a Pacific Northwest tree line on a Tuesday evening. Something standing still, waiting. A flashlight came on, not pointed at her, pointed at the ground, deliberately non-threatening, illuminating the boots of the person holding it and nothing else. A posture she recognized, a way of saying, "I'm not a threat, but I need you to see me." "Whitmore." The voice was female, clipped, and familiar. Kraus sent me. My name is Ballard. We have about 6 minutes before the two-car team in that lot figures out you went out the back, and I have a vehicle on the far side of this tree line. A pause. I've been working Sentinel for 6 months. I know where the facility is, and I know what's in it. Rook had not moved from his point, but his tail had shifted, one slow, measured wag, the kind that wasn't excitement, but something more specific. Recognition of a scent, a person he'd encountered before, a person who had been at the facility. How do I know Kraus actually sent you? Megan said. The flashlight shifted. The woman held up her phone, screen facing out. A text from a number Megan recognized as Kraus's personal cell. 4 words. Go with her. Trust. Megan looked at Rook one more time. He was already moving toward Ballard. She followed. Behind them, through the trees, she heard a door slam in the motel parking lot. And then voices, sharp and urgent, realizing the room was empty, realizing they'd moved too slow. By the time the voices reached the tree line, Megan, Rook, and the woman named Ballard were already in the vehicle, moving north in the dark, towards 63 acres of timberland, and whatever Victor Hale had buried there and believed was safe. Ballard drove like someone who had planned the route before she'd needed it, which she had. Her name was Teresa Ballard, former Army CID special agent, retired 14 months ago, roughly the same window as Olivia's departure from NCIS, which was not a coincidence. She was 53, compact and deliberate, with short, gray-streaked hair and a scar along her left jawline from something she didn't explain and Megan didn't ask about. She drove with both hands on the wheel and talked without looking away from the road, which Megan respected. Kraus reached me 2 hours ago, Ballard said. I've been sitting on what I have for 6 months because I didn't have enough to move, and I couldn't find anyone to move with who wasn't already compromised. He told me about you, about the dog. She glanced in the rearview mirror at Rook, who was in the back seat watching the road ahead with professional attention. I need you to understand something before we get there. What's at that facility is not just financial records. I've done 2 reconnaissance passes in the last 3 months. There's a storage structure, reinforced, with an independent power supply. It's been actively maintained. Someone has been going in and out on an irregular schedule. Hale? Or people working for him. I couldn't get close enough to identify individuals. The access road has sensor coverage, passive infrared probably, and the clearing around the structure is open ground for 40 meters in every direction, not something you approach casually. She paused. But there's a secondary approach from the federal adjacent parcel to the north. The sensor coverage has a gap along the fence line on that side. I found it on the second pass. That's how we go in. What's in the structure? I don't know exactly, but 6 months ago, I cross-referenced the Shell Company financials against DEA evidence logs from the Sentinel mission window. There was a discrepancy. Logged evidence weight versus transferred evidence weight, off by enough to account for 300 kilograms of seized product that never made it to any DEA facility. Megan processed that. He kept the drugs, along with the financial records that would document the network the cartel used to move money. The records that, in the right hands, could dismantle the whole financial infrastructure. Ballard's voice was flat and factual. The drugs are leverage. The records are the real prize. If he still has them, he can sell the records back to the network, piece by piece, at whatever price he names. It's a revenue stream, long-term, extremely lucrative, and completely untraceable as long as nobody gets into that building. The truck moved north through the dark. Megan watched the road and thought about the shape of it. A decorated commander who had spent years building the right connections, the right access, the right reputation, and then one day decided that reputation was worth more converted to cash than spent on service. That kind of decision didn't happen overnight. It built slowly, like a fracture under load. And once it completed, everything else followed a logic that was internally coherent, even if it was monstrous. You protected the asset. You eliminated the witnesses. You buried the evidence and maintained the cover and stayed very, very still. Until a dog with a chip turned up at a county auction and a nurse raised her hand. How far out? Megan asked. 20 minutes to the federal parcel boundary. Another 10 on foot to the fence gap. Ballard reached into the back seat without looking and produced a small pack. I have 2 sets of NVGs, a trauma kit, a handheld GPS with the approach route loaded, and a radio on a frequency Kraus can monitor from the hospital. He's sitting with Olivia Hartwell right now, which I understand you arranged. Olivia got to Kraus? She got to him about 40 minutes after you did. She's more persistent than she looks. A faint pause. She also has a contact in JAG she didn't tell you about. Someone she's been careful with for a long time. If we get what we need from that facility tonight, the package goes to JAG directly. Not through NCIS, not through DoD channels that Hale can access. Military judicial. Kraus co-signs the submission. Megan sat with that for a moment. The plan had more infrastructure than she'd realized. She'd been thinking of this as something she was doing largely alone, improvising under pressure, and instead it turned out she'd walked into the middle of something that had been building for 6 months. People waiting, separately, for the piece that would make it move. The piece had been a dog nobody wanted for $5. Does Hale know about you? She asked Ballard. Not by name. He knows someone has been in the financial records. He knows NCIS flagged the anomalies before closing the file. He doesn't know how far the thread goes. Ballard's jaw tightened slightly. He thinks he's been thorough. Men like Hale always think they've been thorough. He sent people to the coffee shop, Megan said. He traced the chip within hours. He had 2 vehicles at my apartment and a 2-car team at the motel. I know. Which means we have a window tonight that closes when he decides surveillance isn't working and shifts to something harder. She glanced at Megan. We need to be in and out of that facility before he makes that call. They left the truck on a logging access road inside the federal parcel boundary, tucked behind a screen of Douglas fir that would hide it from aerial observation. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s and the sky was overcast. Good cover, no moon. Megan pulled on the thermal layer from Ballard's pack, clipped Rook's lead to a hands-free harness loop, and checked the GPS. Ballard handed her a set of NVGs. You good with these? 4 years practice. Right. Ballard put on her own set. The fence gap is here. She pointed to the GPS display. Then we follow the tree line inside the northern boundary for 200 meters. The structure is here. Single door, north face. I've seen what looks like a standard commercial padlock from distance, but I couldn't confirm. If it's a standard padlock, I can manage it. And if it's not, then we improvise. Megan looked at Rook. He'll alert on the scent of anyone inside before we get close. If the building's occupied, we know before we reach the door. Ballard accepted that with a nod. They moved. The approach was slow and deliberate. The patience of it was something Megan had to consciously rebuild after years in a hospital where speed was the variable that mattered. Out here, the variable was silence. She moved through the tree line with Rook slightly ahead and left, his pace matching hers without instruction, the two of them settling into a working rhythm that felt simultaneously unfamiliar and entirely natural. He'd done this before, with someone else. And she understood, walking through the dark with him, that what had been built between that dog and his original handler, the trust, the coordination, the wordless operational fluency, wasn't gone. It had just been waiting for someone who spoke the same language. The fence gap was where Ballard said it was, a section of aged wire that had separated from a rotted post, leaving a space wide enough to pass through with minimal effort. They went through one at a time, Rook last, and came out into the open northern boundary of the property. The structure was visible from there, a low, dark shape in the middle of the clearing, 60 meters out. No lights on. No visible movement. Rook walked forward without tension in his lead, which told her the building was empty of people. She trusted that more than she would have trusted her own eyes. They crossed the clearing fast and low, breaking into a controlled jog across the open ground, reaching the north face of the structure in under 40 seconds. Megan put her back against the wall, breathing controlled, and took a moment to read the door. Standard commercial padlock. She almost felt something that might have been relief. Ballard pulled a compact tool roll from her pack with the pragmatic expression of someone who had stopped explaining certain things a long time ago. 30 seconds. The padlock opened. Inside was cold and smelled of concrete and something chemical beneath that. Not drugs, not directly, but the particular smell of stored containers and dry climate control. Ballard's flashlight, red-filtered, swept the space. It was bigger inside than the exterior suggested. High ceiling, poured concrete floor, metal shelving units along 2 walls. On the shelves, hard cases, the kind used for military equipment storage. A folding table with a laptop and external drives, all of it covered in a thin film of dust that suggested the last visit had been weeks ago. and along the far wall, a row of sealed evidence containers, the standard federal format, tamper-evident seals, each one tagged with a chain of custody label in the standard format. Except the chain of custody labels were blank. Megan moved to the table and looked at the laptop. Closed, dusty, but the charging cable was still plugged into a power strip connected to a small generator unit. The generator wasn't running, but it had been recently. The fuel gauge read 3/4. "The drives," Ballard said quietly, already moving toward the shelving. Megan opened the laptop. It powered on. The dust hadn't reached the internals. Password protected, but Derek had included a small toolkit on the drive she was carrying, and she had enough technical foundation from her Signal Corps adjacency to know what to do with a boot environment. She worked it methodically, without rushing, while Ballard began documenting the evidence containers with a small camera, photographing every label and seal. Rook sat by the door and watched the clearing outside. The laptop took 11 minutes. When she got into the file structure, she found what she expected, and worse. Operational planning documents for the Sentinel mission, not the official version, the actual version, with Hale's annotations. Financial transfer records, complete and time-stamped. A folder of encrypted communications she couldn't open here but could extract. And a video file, time-stamped 14 months ago, that she clicked on with her stomach already knowing. The footage was from a body camera, point of view, moving through a structure she didn't recognize, voices in the background. Then a wide room, and in it, the members of Task Force Sentinel. Not dead in an ambush. Alive, secured, zip-tied to chairs in a row. She watched 14 seconds of it and stopped. She closed her eyes for 2 seconds, opened them. "Ballard." Her voice was level. "I need your camera." Ballard came over. Megan played the footage. Ballard watched it without expression, but a muscle in her jaw worked once. "He recorded it," Ballard said quietly. "He records everything. It's how he maintains leverage. On everyone." Megan started copying files to the drive. "The people who carried this out, they're on that footage too. That's how he keeps them in line, mutual assured destruction. Until it all goes on record somewhere he can't reach it." "That's tonight," Megan said. She was copying the last folder when Rook stood up. Not a gradual shift, instantaneous, from sitting to fully alert, facing the door. Low in his throat, something that wasn't quite a sound, more a change in his breathing that Megan registered as clearly as an alarm. Someone was on the property. She closed the laptop, pulled the drive, killed Ballard's flashlight. They went still in the dark. Outside, across the clearing, the sound of tires on the access road. Not from the north, from the south, from the main access point. A vehicle moving without lights, which was worse than a vehicle moving with them, because it meant whoever was driving knew exactly where they were going. "Secondary exit," Ballard whispered. "There isn't one." "Window, south wall." Megan felt her way along the shelving to the south wall. There was a window, narrow, utility-sized, hinged outward. She calculated the opening and her own dimensions and decided it was going to be unpleasant, but possible. Rook was not going to enjoy it either. The vehicle stopped outside. A door opened and closed. One door, one person. One person, no lights, no backup. She thought about that. Hale's surveillance teams had come in multiples. The coffee shop, the motel, all of it minimum 2 vehicles, multiple personnel. One person alone, at night, moving quietly, was a different calculation entirely. She stayed at the window and didn't move. A knock on the door. Quiet, specific. 3 knocks, pause, 2. Ballard exhaled slowly beside her. "That's Krause's signal." Megan crossed back to the door and opened it. Colonel Everett Krause stood in the clearing with his hands visible, and his expression that of a man who had driven 40 minutes in the dark and was not entirely certain this was going to be worth it. He was in civilian clothes, which on a man his size and bearing looked slightly wrong, like a set that didn't quite fit the actor. "How did you find the approach?" Megan said. "Ballard's GPS backup. She sent me the route when you left." He stepped inside without being invited. "Olivia's contact at JAG came through. We have a military judge standing by for an emergency evidence submission, off hours. The submission needs to be in hand, physical drive, documented chain of custody. Within 3 hours." He looked at the shelving, the evidence containers, the laptop. He absorbed it with the face of a man who had suspected this for a long time and still found the confirmation heavy. "How much do you have?" "Enough," Megan said. "Financial records, communications, operational planning documents, and a video recording of the unit before—" She stopped. "You should see it later, not right now." Kraus looked at her. He understood. "Chain of custody starts here," Ballard said. She was already filling out documentation forms, physical ones, pulled from the pack, because physical paper created a record that didn't depend on any system Hale could access. "I document what's on these shelves. You two sign as witnesses. The drive goes with you, Colonel." "And the facility?" "We lock it and leave it exactly as we found it." Megan looked at him. "If we move anything, the defense will argue contamination. The physical evidence stays until JAG can authorize a formal search team. That requires someone to sit on this location until—" "I know!" She looked at Ballard. Ballard looked at her. An understanding passed between them that was quick and practical. "I'll stay," Ballard said. "I've been watching this property for 3 months. Another few hours isn't a hardship." She pulled a radio from her pack and handed one to Kraus. "Channel 7. If anyone comes in on the South Road, I call it in." Kraus took the radio. "This is going to move fast once the submission goes in. JAG will need to act before Hale gets word and lawyers up." "Then move fast," Megan said. She went with Kraus. She didn't want to leave Ballard alone on the property, but the logic was clear, and she didn't let herself argue against clear logic. The drive needed to reach JAG. The submission needed a witness who could speak to the chain of acquisition, and Megan was the one who had acquired it. She was the narrative thread that connected the auction yard to this building, and that thread needed to be physically present in front of a military judge. They drove south in Kraus's car, Rook in the back seat, the drive in Megan's jacket pocket. "Olivia's meeting us at the JAG building," Kraus said. He was driving carefully, precisely, the way he did everything. "Her contact is Colonel Audra Voss. She's been on the military bench for 9 years. She's not connected to any of Hale's command lines. And she's been briefed on the outline of what we're bringing." "Briefed how?" "Olivia gave her enough to understand the scope without the specifics. She knows we're bringing evidence in a case involving the loss of a special operations unit and potential command-level criminal conduct. She didn't ask for names." He paused. "She will ask for names now." "Hale." "Yes." The names sat in the car between them. Kraus drove for another mile before he spoke again. "I knew him," he said. "Not well. Well enough to have thought he was one of the better ones." A beat. "That's not something I'm going to get over quickly." Megan didn't offer him anything consoling because there was nothing consoling to offer. The people who betrayed institutions from the inside were always, by necessity, the ones who had been trusted inside those institutions. That was what made it possible. That was what made it hurt. "The unit," she said. "Task Force Sentinel. Did you know any of them personally?" "One." He didn't elaborate. She didn't push. They drove the rest of the way in silence. The JAG building was a brick structure on the edge of the military installation, lit at the entrance, quiet everywhere else at this hour. Olivia was outside when they pulled in, standing with her arms crossed in the October cold, and she walked toward the car before it stopped moving. "Voss is inside," she said as Megan got out. "She's reviewed the outline. She wants the drive, she wants the documentation, and she wants a statement from you." She looked at Megan directly. "Your full statement, including your service background." "I know." "She's going to ask why you were at a county auction." "I'll tell her." "And why you bought a $5 dog." Megan looked down at Rook. He was sitting beside her knee, ears forward, watching Olivia with the calm attentiveness he gave to everyone who was not a threat. "Because nobody else did," she said. Olivia held her gaze for a moment. Then she turned toward the building. "Let's go." Colonel Audra Voss was a small, sharp-faced woman in her late 50s who looked at Megan the way experienced adjudicators looked at witnesses, with complete attention and no discernible prejudgment. She reviewed the drive's contents on a hardened JAG terminal in a conference room that smelled of old carpet and recycled air, while Megan gave her statement to a legal officer who transcribed it without expression. The process took 90 minutes. Megan was not a person who found bureaucratic processes comforting, but she found this one steady. The deliberateness of it, the weight of each signature and each documented step, the sense of something that had been formless and dangerous solidifying into something that had shape and legal substance. Voss asked about the video file last. Megan told her what was on it. Not what she'd seen frame by frame, just the substance of it. What it showed. What it meant. Voss sat very still for a moment after that. Then she said, "I'll be filing for an emergency sealed warrant for Commander Victor Hale within the hour." Simultaneous notification to NCIS, the DoD Inspector General, and the U.S. Attorney's Office. She looked at Megan steadily. "You understand that once this is filed, you may be in a more exposed position for a window of time before the warrant is executed." "How long a window?" "Depends on where Hale is tonight. If he's local, potentially very short. His legal team will be notified when the warrant is served, not before, which limits his advance warning. But men in his position often have informal networks that move faster than formal processes." "I know." Megan leaned forward slightly. "How fast can you move?" Voss looked at her with something that might have been the first stage of respect, not fully formed yet, but present. "Fast," she said. "I don't do things slowly when they matter." She stood. The meeting was over. In the corridor outside, Olivia put a hand briefly on Megan's arm, a contact that lasted 2 seconds and communicated more than a longer gesture would have. Then her phone buzzed, and she looked at the screen and her expression changed. "Ballard," she said. Megan took the phone. Ballard's voice on the other end was low and controlled in the specific way that meant she was managing an active situation. "Vehicle on the South Road, moving slow, no lights. Not the same as tonight's visit. This is 2 vehicles, and one of them stopped at the tree line. They're on foot now." "How many?" "At least 3, based on the sound. Maybe 4. A beat." "They're not coming to look, Megan. They're coming with equipment. I can see light from a thermal unit." Megan's jaw tightened. "Get out of the structure. Get to the north fence, right now. If I leave, the evidence is already off-site. We have it. Get out." She handed the phone back to Olivia. "Call Kraus. Tell him Hale has people at the facility and Ballard needs extraction." She was already moving toward the building's entrance. "Tell him to call local law enforcement and federal JAG warrants in process. That gives us enough to request assistance." "Where are you going?" Megan stopped walking and looked back at Olivia. "Back to the property." "Megan, you just gave your statement. You just handed the evidence to a military judge. You don't have to—" "Ballard is alone out there," Megan said. "She stayed so we could get the evidence to safety. I'm not leaving her alone out there." Olivia held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved across her face that wasn't argument. "Take the radio from Kraus. Stay on Channel 7. Megan took Rook's lead and went out into the dark. She got back to the federal parcel boundary in 22 minutes, which was faster than she should have been driving, and something she acknowledged to herself and continued doing anyway. She parked where Ballard's truck had been, killed the lights, and sat for 30 seconds with the window down and the radio in her hand, listening. Nothing from Channel 7. She tried once. Ballard. Static. Then quiet. "North fence. 2 minutes out. They're in the structure. Are you clear?" "For now." A breath. "There are 4 of them. They found the laptop was accessed. One of them is on a phone. He's reporting back." Reporting to Hale. Who would know within minutes that the drive was gone, that the files had been copied, that the facility had been accessed, and the evidence documented? Who would know that whatever window he had for containing this was closing? Megan got out of the car, brought Rook, moved through the tree line. She found Ballard at the fence gap, crouched, radio in hand, controlled but running on the particular energy of someone who'd been stationary for 2 hours and then moved fast. A cut on her right palm from the fence wire. Nothing serious, self-managed with her own kit. "How'd they get in?" Megan asked. "The South Road sensor. They bypassed it. They knew what they were looking for, which means someone who knows the property." Ballard looked at her. "Hale's people. Not contractors. These are his people. Kraus is calling it in. Voss filed for the warrant. It's moving." "How fast?" "Fast enough if we stall." Ballard looked at her with the expression of someone parsing the word stall against the practical reality of their situation. 4 armed men versus you, me, and the dog. We don't engage them. We stall. We hold the perimeter. We make noise if they try to move anything out. We give Kraus's call time to land." She looked at Rook. "And we let him do what he was trained to do." Rook was facing the structure, 60 meters south. Every line of him was focused, coiled, waiting. Ballard exhaled slowly. You were a combat medic. Yes. How much of this is medic and how much is the other thing? Tonight? Megan glanced at her. More of the other thing. They moved to the north tree line, close enough to observe the structure, inside the fence line, in the shadow of the tree cover. Through the NVGs, Megan could see two of the four men outside the building now, one at the door and one at the corner, covering the eastern approach. The other two were inside. The one at the door was on a radio. Then, on Megan's radio, channel 7, Krause's voice. Federal notification is in. Local law enforcement is 18 minutes out. JAG has Voss's warrant confirmation. Megan, 18 minutes. 18 minutes. She looked at Rook. He was already looking at her, waiting for the signal. She unclipped his lead. He didn't move yet. He was watching the man at the corner of the structure. Not the man at the door, not the two inside. The man at the corner. Megan followed his attention and realized the man at the corner was moving toward the north. Toward them. A slow, methodical sweep, torch low, checking the perimeter. 40 meters. 30. He was going to find them in the tree line in approximately 90 seconds. Megan looked at Ballard. Ballard looked at her. They both looked at Rook. Rook looked at the man. Then he looked at Megan one more time. Not asking permission exactly, but checking, confirming. The way a working dog confirmed the handler's intent before committing. She gave the signal. Not a word. Not a sound. Just a small forward inclination of her head, the way she'd seen it done in training footage years ago and understood instinctively now. Rook moved. He was fast in the way that trained working dogs were fast. Not the explosive chaos of an attacking animal, but directed, precise speed that covered 30 meters before the man at the corner registered movement. When he did register it, he turned and his mouth opened to shout, and Rook hit him at the shoulder rather than the throat. Controlled, trained, the grip designed to bring down without destroying, and the man went to the ground hard, weapon arm pinned. The shout came out anyway, fragments of it. Enough. The man at the door spun. He shouted something toward the interior. Megan was already moving left along the tree line, staying in shadow, and Ballard went right. And for a moment the two men outside were looking in different directions, trying to understand what had happened to the perimeter. Megan had her radio up. Krause, we have contact. 4 men. Can you push the timeline? A beat. Working on it. From inside the structure, raised voices. The sound of something metal shifted against concrete, the evidence containers. They were trying to move them. The man Rook had taken down was not incapacitated. He was on the ground but trying to get control of his arm, shouting, which meant he was going to be on his feet in under a minute. Rook maintained the grip without escalating, which was itself a display of training that Megan registered with a distant, focused appreciation. He wasn't trying to hurt the man more than necessary. He was holding him, buying time. Megan counted the seconds, counted the distance between the men outside and the tree line, counted the sound of movement inside the structure. 13 minutes. She looked at Ballard across the clearing and mouthed, "Hold." Ballard nodded once, flat and certain, the face of someone who had decided. The man at the door made a decision of his own. He raised his radio, spoke quickly. A report, an update, a request for instruction. He was looking at the man on the ground, and at the dog, and at the darkness around him, trying to understand the geometry of the situation, how many people he was dealing with, where the threat was coming from. The radio crackled back at him. A voice. Not a request for instruction. An order. And the man's posture changed when he received it, a stiffening, a decision made for him from the outside. And Megan understood in the same instant that Hale had given the order, and the order was not hold position and was not withdraw. It was something else. Inside the structure, the sound of movement stopped, and the door opened, and a man came out leading with a weapon and a tablet that had a screen bright enough to see even without NVGs, and on the screen, a live video feed that it took Megan 2 full seconds to recognize. Krause's office. Inside the JAG building. Live. Current. The timestamp in the corner was running, and in the feed, Colonel Audra Voss was sitting at the conference table, still reviewing documentation, unaware. The man held the tablet up toward the tree line, toward where Megan was, as if he knew exactly where she was, which meant the thermal unit Ballard had mentioned was still active and pointing north. He spoke at the tree line. not shouting, conversationally, almost. He says you have something that belongs to him, the man said. He says you give it back, and the colonel walks out of that building tonight. You don't give it back. He let the sentence end where it was. Rook released his grip on the man on the ground, not because Megan signaled it, because he was reading her, and what he read was a stillness that was not surrender, but something that came before the answer to surrender. She stepped out of the tree line. She stood in the clearing in the dark, the NVGs around her neck, the radio in her hand, and she looked at the man with the tablet and she said, very clearly, "The drive isn't with me." The man waited. "It's already filed," she said. "It's already in the record. It's been in the record for—" She checked her watch. 47 minutes. She looked at him steadily. "Whatever he told you this would accomplish, it's too late. The warrant's issued. The file is sealed. Threatening a military judge doesn't undo a sealed warrant. It adds charges to the ones that are already coming." Silence in the clearing. Rook came to her side. The man with the tablet looked at the screen. He looked at Megan. He looked at the screen again, and in his expression, barely there, controlled, but present, something shifted. He was deciding whether he believed her. And somewhere, on the other end of whatever connection Hale had to this operation, Victor Hale was making the same calculation. Then, at the far edge of the property, on the south road, the first set of headlights appeared, moving fast, not trying to be quiet, the white and blue strobes cutting through the darkness just visible above the tree line. And behind them, a second set, and behind those, a third. The man with the tablet lowered it. Rook sat beside Megan's knee in the dark clearing with his ears forward and his breathing steady, and she put her hand on the back of his neck and felt him lean into it, just slightly. The same small acknowledgement he'd given her in the auction yard when the leash first touched her palm. "I'm here. I've been waiting." The vehicles came up the south road, and the radio in Megan's hand crackled with Krause's voice, and behind her she heard Ballard come out of the tree line to stand beside her, and the man with the tablet took 3 steps backward and then stopped because there was nowhere left to go. It was over in the sense that the containment was done, but Megan knew, standing in the dark with the federal vehicles coming and Rook steady at her side, that the next part was not going to be clean or quick or simple. The next part was going to be a military judicial process with lawyers and depositions and a defense team that would use every available mechanism to complicate what was, at its core, very simple. What was simple? A commander had betrayed his people, erased his witnesses, buried his crimes, and sold a dog for $5 to complete the erasure. What was also simple? The dog was still here, and so was she. The first federal vehicle pulled into the clearing with its lights flooding everything white and flat, and in the harsh, overexposed brightness of it, Megan saw the man with the tablet set it on the ground and put his hands up. And she saw the 2 men come out of the structure behind him, and she saw the man Rook had taken down rise slowly from the ground with his arm held at an angle that suggested he'd be seeing a doctor tonight. She'd check it herself after the agents had secured the scene, because old habits didn't ask for permission. But first she stood in the clearing and let the light hit her, and she didn't move, and neither did Rook. And she thought about Victor Hale on the other end of a dead radio connection, in whatever room, in whatever building, with whatever plan he'd had that had just ended, processing the fact that the woman he'd dismissed as just a nurse had just walked his entire operation into a sealed federal record. Her radio crackled. Krause. "Voss is secure. 2 agents are with her now. Hale's location is confirmed. He's at his residence on base. NCIS is moving." She pressed the radio. "Copy." She put it in her pocket. She looked down at Rook, who was looking up at her with those amber eyes that hadn't been broken when she found him, had never been broken, had just been waiting for someone who understood what they were seeing. "Almost," she told him. He held her gaze, and across the clearing her phone buzzed in her jacket, the personal one she'd powered off at the motel and forgotten to turn back on. And when she pulled it out and looked at the screen, she had 17 missed calls from a number she'd never seen, and 1 text message sent 42 minutes ago that read, "You should know there's a second facility. This one has a survivor." She read the text twice. A second facility. A survivor. The federal agents were still moving through the clearing, securing the 4 men, calling in the structure, establishing the scene with the methodical efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this. Nobody was looking at her. Nobody was waiting for her to make a decision. She called the number. It rang once. A man answered. His voice was hoarse in the specific way of someone who hadn't spoken much recently, not from disuse, but from damage, from a throat that had been through something and was still recovering. "Who is this?" she said. "My name is Sergeant First Class Dale Oram." A breath. "I was the handler for K9 Rook, Task Force Sentinel. I've been watching this number for 3 months, waiting for someone to activate that chip." Another breath, careful, like breathing still required conscious management. "I need to know if the dog is alive." Megan looked at Rook. "He's alive," she said. "He's standing next to me." The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds, and was the loudest 4 seconds she'd experienced in a long time. "Where are you?" she asked. "A private medical facility outside Crestwood, Oregon. Not voluntary." His voice tightened. "Hale's people brought me here 9 months ago. They've been keeping me stable enough to be leverage and incapacitated enough not to be a problem." A pause. "I heard the secondary transmission from the chip when you activated it at the shop. That's how I got this number. I had access to a phone for about 6 minutes last week, and I pulled the activation log from a system I wasn't supposed to be able to reach." "How many people are holding you?" "2 on rotation. Night shift is 1 person. It's 0200 now." His voice was flat and factual, a soldier giving a situation report. "The front entrance has a keypad. The room I'm in has a standard lock. I'm ambulatory, but I have a left leg that's been managed rather than treated, which means it's been kept functional enough for mobility, but not functional enough for escape. I've had 9 months to think about what that distinction means." Megan absorbed all of it in real time, running the calculations. Crestwood was 40 minutes north. 1 person on night security. A man who could walk but not run. Medical needs that she was better positioned to assess and address than almost anyone else who might arrive. She looked up. Kraus was 20 feet away, talking to a federal agent, and she caught his eye and held it until he read her face and ended the conversation and came to her. She showed him the texts, told him what she'd heard. He didn't waste time reacting. "I'll get Voss on the phone. NCIS needs to redirect to Crestwood simultaneously with the Hale arrest. If Hale gets word before they reach that facility, whoever is holding Oram gets a call." "How fast can you make that happen?" 10 minutes. He might not have 10 minutes of battery on whatever phone he found. Kraus was already dialing. Megan went back to her call. "Oram, stay on the line. We're getting people to you. Do not do anything that gives them a reason to move you before we arrive." "Understood." A pause. "Is he okay?" "The dog." She looked at Rook again. He was watching her with his full attention, reading the tension in her voice the way he read everything. Not with anxiety, but with readiness. The posture of an animal that understood something was happening and was waiting to know what his part in it was. "He's good," she said. "He's been good the whole time." Another silence from Oram's end that carried a weight she didn't try to name. "He was the only one who made it out," Oram said quietly. "Everyone else, I watched the footage. Hale showed it to me when he was trying to make a point about cooperation." His voice didn't break, but it flattened. In the way voices flattened when a person was managing something very large, very carefully. "I cooperated, because I was hoping something like this would happen eventually." A breath. "I kept thinking, if they couldn't find the dog, someone else might. Someone who'd know what to look for." "He ended up at a county auction," Megan said. $5 bid. No takers until me." "Why did you take him?" She thought about the auction yard, the way Rook had stood with his head down and his ribs showing and lifted his eyes when the leash touched her palm. "I don't know exactly," she said. "I just did." She heard Kraus behind her saying Crestwood and giving the address Oram had relayed and the name Voss and the words active survivor, coordinate simultaneously with primary arrest. She heard the federal agent's voice shift register, the particular shift of someone updating their operational picture in real time. "Oram," she said, "people are coming. Stay on the line." "Copy," he said. And then, quietly, "Thank you." She didn't go to Crestwood herself. That was the right call, and she knew it, and it cost her something to make it anyway. Kraus made her make it, not by ordering her, but by laying out the logic simply and letting her arrive at the conclusion herself. NCIS and federal agents were en route with the authority and the numbers and the legal standing. Her presence added risk without adding capacity. Her presence was needed at the primary scene, where the chain of custody for everything in that building was going to be examined in detail by a defense team looking for any gap, any irregularity, any thread they could pull. She stayed. She gave her statement a second time to a different agent, more detailed, more specific, covering the chip read and the property trail and the text from Orem and the phone call with the timestamp she'd noted on the way. Ballard gave her statement beside her. Krause provided supplementary documentation. The agents who had processed the 4 men on the property worked the scene with evidence bags and cameras and chain of custody forms that would be scrutinized for the next 3 years. At 03:47, her phone buzzed. NCIS, facility secured, Orem in custody of federal medical personnel, 2 arrests on site, condition stable. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the bumper of one of the federal vehicles in the cold October dark and put her face in her hands for approximately 30 seconds, which was as long as she allowed herself. Rook pushed his nose against her knee. She lifted her head and looked at him. "Okay," she said. "Okay." Victor Hale was arrested at 0412 at his residence on the Redwood Valley Base installation, in his kitchen, in civilian clothes, by 4 NCIS agents carrying a sealed military warrant signed by Colonel Audra Voss. He did not resist. He did not speak. His attorney was called and arrived 40 minutes later, at which point Hale said 9 words and then said nothing else for a very long time. The 9 words were, reportedly, "You have no idea how deep this goes." As it turned out, they had a reasonable idea. The prosecution that followed was not quick and was not clean, because it never was. There were motions and counter-motions and classification disputes, and a defense strategy built on attacking the chain of custody for the chip data, the admissibility of the financial records, and the credibility of every witness. The defense team was good. Hale had resources and connections, and those things didn't evaporate at the moment of arrest. They reorganized and adapted, the way money and influence always did. But the video file was what broke it. Not in the courtroom, initially. In the court of institutional gravity, the weight of documented evidence that showed, without ambiguity, the commander of a special operations unit ordering the execution of that unit's members in a private facility while a trained military working dog sat outside the door and a tracking chip logged the timestamp. There was no version of that footage that could be explained away. There was no framing that accommodated it. The 2 men who had carried out the orders on the footage took plea agreements within 6 weeks of the arrest and provided testimony that corroborated and expanded what the documents already showed. The shell company structure was dismantled. The cartel financial records in the facility, the ones Hale had been leveraging for months, were seized and transferred to DEA, where they provided enough actionable intelligence to disrupt a significant portion of the network. The original Sentinel mission had targeted. The mission, in a strange way, completed itself. Hale was charged with 7 counts of murder in the first degree, conspiracy, evidence tampering, obstruction of military justice, financial crimes, and the unlawful detention of Sergeant First Class Dale Orem. The trial lasted 11 weeks. The verdict took the jury less than 2 days. Life without the possibility of parole. No appeals that moved. The 3 officers in his command structure who had enabled the cover-up from the administrative side, who had processed the false records, closed the NCIS inquiry, managed Olivia's departure, were separately charged and separately convicted on reduced counts in exchange for cooperation. Their careers ended. Some of them went to prison. All of them lost the pensions and commendations and institutional standing that had, for years, been their insulation against accountability. Accountability, when it finally arrived, was thorough. Dale Orem spent 6 weeks in a military medical facility. His left leg required 2 surgical procedures that addressed what 9 months of managed neglect had complicated. He was not going to run, probably ever again, with the same ease he once had. The surgeons were direct about that, and he received the information the way he received most difficult things, by sitting with it for a while and then deciding what it meant for what came next rather than what it meant for what was gone. Megan visited him twice during his recovery. The first time was 4 days after Crestwood, when he was still in the acute phase and the conversation was short and practical. The second time was 3 weeks later, when he was upright and moving and had started the particular kind of restless activity that signaled a person beginning to think about the future again. He looked at Rook for a long time when the dog came into the room. Rook looked at him. Then Rook walked to him and sat beside his chair, the way he'd sat beside Megan's chair in a dozen different rooms over the past weeks, and Orem put his hand on the dog's head and didn't say anything for a while. "He was waiting," Orem said finally. "I think so," Megan said. "For you or for this?" She thought about it honestly because it deserved an honest answer. "I don't know, maybe both. Maybe he couldn't get to this without me, and I couldn't get to this without him. Maybe that's the whole story." Orem looked at her with the eyes of someone who had been held in a room for 9 months, with nothing to do but think, and had arrived at conclusions that were both harder and simpler than the ones he'd held before. "I can't take him back," he said. "Not full time. Not with what the next year looks like for me." He paused. "But I don't want him to disappear again." "He won't," she said. "I promise you that." The arrangement they made was practical and imperfect and right for everyone involved. Rook stayed with Megan, with full understanding that Orem had priority access whenever he wanted it, whenever he was able. It was not a clean resolution. Shared custody of a military working dog between a recovering soldier and a trauma nurse was not a concept that had a form to fill out. They made it up as they went, which was, she was coming to understand how most of the real and durable things in her life had been built. The formal recognition came in the spring, which felt like the wrong season for it. Too bright, too optimistic, when what had happened was built in October dark and cold timberland, and the small hours of mornings that had no good answers. But institutions moved on their own timelines, and she'd long since stopped expecting them to be poetic. The ceremony was held at Redwood Valley Military Medical Center, in the courtyard outside the main entrance, and it was neither large nor small. Colonel Voss was there. Kraus was there, in dress uniform, which he wore with the particular discomfort of a large man who had always looked more natural in the field than at a podium. Olivia was there in a gray suit that she'd clearly bought recently and wasn't entirely comfortable in. Ballard stood at the back with her arms crossed and her jaw scar catching the light, and her expression the one she wore when she was trying not to show that something mattered to her. Orem was there in his dress uniform, with a cane he didn't like and used anyway. The official language of the commendation covered Megan's role in uncovering evidence relevant to a military criminal proceeding, her coordination with federal authorities, and her medical expertise in supporting the operation. It was accurate and thoroughly incomplete, the way official language always was, drained of texture and specificity and the parts that were too human to translate into formal recognition. She received the commendation with both hands and stood straight while the camera clicked, and she thought about the things the language didn't cover. The auction yard in October, the $5 bid, the drive back to Redwood Valley, with a dog she didn't know anything about yet. The kitchen table at 2 a.m. with the thin folder spread out. Derek's shop at dawn. The coffee shop where a man in a gray jacket hadn't ordered anything. The tree line and the cold in Ballard's face in the flashlight's glow. The phone call from Dale Orem at 0200 with a hoarse voice and a question about a dog. She thought about the members of Task Force Sentinel, whose names were read aloud at a separate ceremony 6 weeks earlier, a proper memorial finally completed after 14 months of official silence. 7 soldiers who had gone into a classified mission and not come back, whose families had been told a version of the truth that was architected to protect the man who'd ended them. Those families sat in the front rows of that ceremony. She had been there. She had watched their faces while the names were read, and she'd thought about what it meant to have the truth returned to you after believing a lie for over a year, whether it was relief or something more complicated and less nameable than that. Both, she'd decided. It was both. After the commendation ceremony, standing in the courtyard with the noise of people dispersing around her, Kraus came and stood beside her and looked at Rook, who was sitting at her feet with the patient dignity he brought to all formal occasions. "What happens now?" Kraus asked. It was a question with several meanings, and she chose the one she had an answer to. "I've been talking to the VA about a program," she said. "Retired military working dogs. There are hundreds of them aging out of service every year, some of them injured, most of them going to private adoption through channels that aren't equipped to assess or manage the behavioral and medical complexity involved." She looked at him. "I want to build something here. An actual rehabilitation program, veterinary, behavioral, and medical support combined. Using the hospital's resources and my clinical experience in Petra Novak's practice as the veterinary component." She paused. "Orem wants to be involved when he's recovered enough. He knows more about military K9 operational profiles than anyone I've met." Kraus was quiet for a moment. That would require institutional support and funding. I know. I'm asking for institutional support and funding. He almost smiled. On Kraus, almost a smile was a significant expression. I'll see what I can do. That's all I'm asking. He nodded and walked away, and Olivia took his place beside her. She'd removed her jacket because it was a warm spring afternoon, and she looked like herself again, less pressed, more angular. How are you doing? Olivia asked. Not politely, actually asking. Megan thought about it. I'm okay, she said. I'm better than okay. She looked at Rook. I went to that auction because I needed something to do that wasn't sitting in my apartment. I wasn't looking for anything. Most people aren't. He found me, Megan said. Or I found him. I don't know which one is more accurate. Maybe it doesn't matter which. She thought about that. Thought about the way Rook had looked at her across the auction yard. Not like a lost animal looking for rescue, not like something broken waiting to be fixed, but like a specific look from a specific pair of eyes at a specific moment when neither of them had anywhere else to be. Like recognition. Like something clicking into place. She wasn't sentimental by nature. She believed in mechanism and procedure and things that could be documented and tested. She believed in the evidence that was in front of you and the decision you made with it. She'd made a decision with a $5 bid, and it had led her here, to a spring courtyard with a commendation in her hand and a program taking shape and a piece of herself that had been folded down and stored for years, beginning quietly and imperfectly to unfold again. Not perfectly. Not all at once. She was still the woman who forgot to call the dishwasher repairman and ate half a granola bar for lunch and sometimes sat with old operational memories at 3 in the morning that she didn't share with anyone. She was still complicated and private and better at treating other people's wounds than acknowledging her own. She was going to carry the weight of what she'd seen in that video file for a long time. The faces, the timestamp, the clinical fact of what had been done to 7 people who had trusted their commander. That didn't go away. She didn't expect it to. But she had learned in the past months that carrying something didn't mean being buried by it. That the same capacity that let her function under pressure, the training, the quiet, the ability to hold a great deal of difficult information and still act, was not a wall between her and the rest of her life. It was the foundation of it. The thing she'd been treating as something she'd left behind was actually the thing that had made everything that followed possible. Including the moment in a county auction yard when she looked at a dog nobody wanted and understood, without knowing yet why she understood, that throwing him away would be a mistake. Megan crouched down beside Rook. He met her eyes with that steady amber gaze that hadn't changed since October. Present, attentive, patient without being passive. You weren't abandoned, she told him. You were waiting for someone who understood you. His tail moved once, slow and deliberate. She put her hand against the side of his face, and he leaned into it. The same small lean he'd given her at the auction yard, at the motel, in the clearing with the federal lights flooding the dark. Not dependence. Partnership. The weight of an animal that had chosen to trust her and had not regretted the choice. She stood up. Around her, the courtyard was emptying. Orem was across the space, talking to one of the federal agents who had been at Crestwood, leaning on his cane with the particular posture of a man who refused to let the cane make him look diminished. Ballard was leaving through the side gate, already back to whatever she'd been before this. Watchful, independent, carrying her own thread of things she didn't discuss. Olivia was on her phone, which meant something was moving somewhere, which with Olivia was always the case. The program wasn't built yet. The funding wasn't confirmed. Orem's recovery had 2 surgeries still to go, and the legal proceedings had generated approximately 900 pages of documentation that would require testimony and review and months of institutional follow-through. Nothing was finished. Nothing was clean. But she had learned something in the long arc from a gravel auction yard to this spring courtyard that she was going to keep. The people who dismissed you were often doing you a favor. Not because dismissal was kind, it wasn't, but because it left you alone in the space where you could become exactly what the situation required without anyone's permission or prior approval. The woman they saw as just a nurse had been precisely the right person for every step of what this had become, because she carried things they didn't know to look for and moved in ways they didn't think to watch. She had not been the person they expected. She had been the person the dog was waiting for. And that, she was learning, was not a distinction to waste. She looked out past the courtyard gate to where Rook was already walking, lead slack in her hand, moving with the quiet forward certainty of an animal that had been lost and was not lost anymore, that knew where it was going because it knew where it stood. She followed him.